Fae are one of the most alien creature types to exist in the many worlds of D&D, and their home plane, the Feywild, is just as strange. In this bizarre world of spirits, the rules of what it means to even exist are seemingly turned upside down and sideways. Usually, this is no big deal for folks living on the material plane, but when these two worlds overlap, once in a while, things slip through. Sometimes those things are literal creatures, and other times it might be just a smidge of Feywild magic that changes the rules in the material world, ever so slightly. And the two monsters we're going to talk about today are a perfect example of this phenomenon in action. It's no secret here that I love Fae creatures. You never really know exactly what you're gonna get when dealing with a Fae, and I think that's great. They're just so offbeat compared to most other D&D creature types, and that is most obvious when you look at how they're born. Because Fae don't simply get born the way most living creatures do. Rather than climbing out of an egg or another person, they just sort of manifest as a result of strong vibes. Dryads and nymphs, for example, are two types of Fae born from nature. In ancient and primordial forests that house gateways to the Feywild, they sometimes just appear as a sentient extension of the forest's will. And then you've got redcaps and boggles, both creatures born from the intense emotions experienced within the Feywild, which, come to think of it, most Feywild creatures fall into one of these two categories. I mean, there are obviously some exceptions, like the entire cast of hags, for instance, which are mostly Fey, except for one of them, and the way that they propagate involves this horrible and twisted ritual, but we're really getting into the weeds on this one. At the end of the day, 99% of Fae creatures are either born from the environment or strong emotion. And our first creature today is in the former category. Coming to us from the Monster Manual 5 for D&D 3rd edition, as their name would suggest, the Ruin Chanter is born in ancient ruins. In much the same way that a Dryad is an extension of the forest itself, a Ruin Chanter is an extension of whatever abandoned and forgotten place they spawned from. They look somewhat elven in appearance, but with gray, pallid skin, and are often dressed in tattered robes. Rather than existing as beings of natural vibrancy and abundance, Ruin Chanters are given life by the sadness and loss associated with such cold, dark locales. They live solitary lives among the crumbling ruins of a once great civilization, filling the silence with songs of a forgotten history in the kingdom's former glory, before falling to ruin. They subsist on a diet of ash and dust, and drink whatever water they can find pooling within their crumbling home. To a Ruin Chanter, inhaling air filled with ancient grit and grime hits their nose like the finest perfume, and a night filled with nothing but silence, save for the creaking of bygone structures, is an ideal piece. I'm sure they're very fun at parties. Ruin Chanters are weird little dudes, and I love them. They fulfill the same role that any forest spirit would, except their home is made out of smashed buildings and garbage, which is exactly the kind of place many adventurers end up for some reason. They spend their days protecting the ruin in which they live, which of course means driving away looters and trespassers, but it also means preserving the history of whatever this ruin once was. They're not only gifted record keepers and essentially archaeologists, but due to their special connection with the ruins, they have supernatural insight into the place as it once was, even if there are no written records to speak of. And while they are generally solitary, they can sometimes be found with other creatures native to the ruins themselves. These other creatures are usually undead. After all, no one loves a dilapidated city quite like a haunting ghost. But they also might live among constructs or other mindless servants who are just fulfilling whatever task it was they were set to. And in some cases, if the ruin's large enough, maybe even other Ruin Chanters. They're pretty territorial, so it's not like they're hanging out in a big abandoned frat house together or anything, but sometimes there can be multiple Ruin Chanters living within an expansive ruin, and they will communicate with one another through song. Usually the songs they sing are culturally relevant somehow to whatever ruin they occupy, but many of these songs hold a specific meaning for the Ruin Chanter that can be interpreted by them to mean all kinds of different stuff. If Tommy over in the Central District is singing Despacito, better leave him alone. But if he starts singing Come Sail Away, dude is definitely down to party. And while not necessarily cruel and definitely not evil by intent, Ruin Chanters aren't exactly warm and snuggly people. They tend to have a cold disposition and are strikingly direct in conversation, always telling you exactly how they feel and what they want. And what they want is usually for you to get the hell out of their house.
So I'm gonna pay you $100 to fuck off.
And if you don't, they're more than happy to use force to try and make you. They're not necessarily out for blood, they're not gonna pursue you and make sure that you're destroyed, but they're not gonna be upset if they manage to kill you while you're refusing to leave their home, which you have just wandered into. And if they are forced to kill you, again, they're not gonna feel bad about it, but they don't take pleasure in the act of killing. They're not sadists, they just don't really care if you live or die as long as you're not here anymore. Though thankfully, if you do encounter a violent ruin chanter within the depths of some forgotten dungeon, this week's sponsor, the folks over at Cheipaku, have got you covered, at least as far as battle maps go. Cheipaku is a dynamic map-making duo who have perfected the art of TTRPG digital map design. They create seemingly everything, ranging from maps to suit a classic dungeon crawl to outlandish themes like a kobold brewery or a giant elderbrain skull. Whatever nonsense your players have gotten themselves into, it's weirdly likely that Cheipaku has an incredible map to suit your needs. They have a collection of over 4,000 hand-drawn, high-res, highly detailed locations, and you can access all of them through the Cheipaku Patreon for only a few dollars each month. They also take suggestions, so if you somehow managed to come up with an idea for a battle map you'd like to see brought to life and they haven't made it already, you can leave a suggestion as one of their patrons, and they might just get around to making it. Their maps are all ready for the virtual tabletop, and they even come with variant options such as time of day or even what season it is. I have personally used a bunch of their battle maps in my own DMing career over the years, and honestly, this is a genuine recommendation from me. The value here is wild. Like, the cost relative to the sheer amount of content a subscription to their Patreon gives you is so crazy. I encourage you to check out the link down below and see for yourself what they've got on offer. I promise you won't be disappointed. After all, you're gonna need a sick battle map for your encounter with this fey creature. Yeah, I use the same segue both in and out of the ad. What of it? Speaking of which, let's talk about what these Feywild dungeon dwellers can actually do at the game table. Clocking in at CR 13, the Ruin Chanter is certainly no joke. First and foremost, when it comes to bonking interlopers, the Chanter is well prepared with an ornate adamantine mace. This mace doesn't do anything special aside from, being made out of adamantine, but it gives them a solid weapon to use and keeps their other hand free for doing some nonsense fey magic. What kind of fey magic, you ask? Well, you know how everybody is just terrified of rust monsters? They can basically do the same thing. The rusting grasp action sees the Chanter grabbing a non-magical metal object and watching it corrode into a pile of brown dust. This can target weapons, armor, and equipment, but also just large areas of metal such as a steel wall or a metal cage. And while it does only affect non-magic objects, anyone who's tangled with rust monsters in the past will be able to tell you being without your gear, even just the mundane stuff midway through a dungeon, is no good.
That's no good.
They're also exceptionally nimble, allowing them to dash as a bonus action, and despite the fact that they generally prefer to walk on the ground, the Ruin Chanter has a fly speed.
They fly now!
They fly now?
They fly now!
So if you see this thing start flying around, just be aware you've messed up. It can also use a bonus action called Chanter's Inspiration that works pretty much the same way as a Bard's Inspiration, which, in case it wasn't obvious by now, the Ruin Chanter is very Bard-like. And that extends to its only reaction, Counter Chant, which allows them or an ally to re-roll on a save with advantage if they fail against being charmed or frightened. And that brings us to the final ability on this creature's stat block, the Curse of Infirmity. This action is literally a curse placed by the Ruin Chanter to temporarily age its victim either physically or mentally. If it curses your body, you have disadvantage on all d20 rolls associated with strength, dexterity, and constitution. If it curses your mind, same deal, but with intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Fortunately, this curse only lasts for 1 hour, and it has to choose one of the two afflictions to affect a single creature with. It can't target the same person with both halves of the curse. But damn if that ain't a brutal debuff. And when all else fails, if the Chanter just really needs to absolutely beat its enemy to a pulp, it can always rely on its trusty ally, the Ruin Elemental. And that brings us to the one and only trait on its stat sheet, which is called call Ruin Elemental. This is something the Ruin Chanter can only do once per week, and it involves conducting a complex ritual that takes an hour to perform, at the end of which a segment of the ruin is brought to life as a brand new living creature. So let's talk about that for a sec. Ruin Elementals are fairly simple beings. They're large, CR9 creatures that have a body literally made up of the ruins they were born in. They've got a brutal slam attack and a rock throwing attack, which can hit like a truck. They can also use the shockwave bonus action to knock down everyone around them, assuming a failed save, and they come bundled with a ton of immunities. They are sentient with an intelligence score of 8, but like most elementals, they tend to be pretty single-minded in their pursuits. Most Ruin Elementals simply live life under the direction of the Chanter who created them, but in the event that Chanter is no longer around for some reason, they'll generally just default to protecting the ruins they call home. One fun quirk about these guys is they've got the false appearance trait, meaning that as long as they are prone and remaining completely still, they're completely indistinguishable from a pile of rubble. If you've ever played a Final Fantasy game, you know how that goes. So anytime you encounter a Ruin Chanter on their turf, just be aware that they might have allies all around you, waiting for the opportune moment to spring to life and start mopping the floor with your party. But who knows how that would actually play out? In fact, the vast array of encounter potential for these two creatures is a big part of the reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place. So let's talk about how the hell you might actually use these creatures at the game table. At their most basic, the Ruin Chanter along with some Ruin Elementals can make for a great random encounter in an abandoned ruin or some kind of dungeon. I love the idea of the players traversing an underground labyrinth that was once a great kingdom and hearing distant song, only to track down the source of the singing and find a Ruin Chanter. How things go from here? Who could say? A straight up fight between the Chanter and its allies could be a really fun combat encounter, but I also really like the idea of a Chanter who is willing to cooperate with the party as long as they do something for it. Maybe a terrible monster has taken up residence in the ruins, and the Chanter is worried that this monster will eventually bring the whole place toppling down, so it begrudgingly agrees to let the players keep whatever MacGuffin or treasure it was that drove them down here in the first place if they're able to slay this monster. There would have to be some reason that the Ruin Chanter wouldn't be able to take care of this monster themselves. If you're running a higher level campaign, perhaps it's actually just an extremely dangerous monster that outclasses the Ruin Chanter, or it could be trapped in a part of the ruin that the Chanter has been unable to access for some reason. It could be in an underground temple lair that's warded against Fae and Celestials and Fiends, so it's not able to pass the threshold or something. I also really like the idea that maybe the monster down there isn't some Balrog or something, but it's the Tarrasque or a creature equivalent to it, some kind of massive kaiju that is in a near permanent state of slumber, and the players have to do some kind of ritual to keep it asleep. And if they can do that, the Ruin Chanter, of course, will be on their side. Or maybe the Ruin Chanter's song is actually the thing keeping the Tarrasque asleep, and if the players kill the Ruin Chanter or disturb it in some way, it will cause the monster to wake up, and they won't have their songstress around to put it back to sleep. I also think that a quest to find the Ruin Chanter specifically would not only make a lot of sense, but could also be a really fun twist on the idea. Since they know so much about the places they live, maybe the party is after a long-lost secret that only someone with intimate knowledge of the ruins could possess. It might even be a way to provide an info drop to the players that subverts something about the campaign they thought they knew, thus throwing a twist into the mix. Perhaps ancient records show the current ruler's claim to the throne is invalid, or maybe they reveal something about the primary villain's past that gives them more information about him and thus an edge. Or maybe the Ruin Chanter isn't in the picture at all, and you just want to use the Ruin Elementals as ancient guardians who protect the dungeon from any and all intruders, including the players. Having a massive courtyard filled with ruinous piles of debris, which all rise up and attack the unsuspecting party, could be a great combat encounter, or, you know, a chase if they understandably don't want to stick around. And speaking of sticking around, another small detail mentioned by the book that these guys show up in is that they not only seek to protect the ruins they live in, but they also look forward to restoring them, if possible. And I think that's extremely cool, because it opens the door to a whole wide array of weird possible adventures here. Maybe your players stumble upon a Ruin Chanter and they want to help the Chanter actively restore the ruin to its former glory. What happens then? You could literally make a whole campaign around the idea of the party going on missions to clear out dangerous monsters living in the ruins, securing gold to pay for repairs, or, you know, anything else that contributes to the restoration of this place. Maybe that even includes finding new residents to move in once the place is actually fit for humanoid life. I especially love this idea as a way to give your players a base of operations they can build up over time. Maybe the ruin they find is an old decrepit castle keep, but once they clear out the monsters living there, they come across a ruin chanter who wants to preserve the castle. So they agree to help restore it back to its former glory, and are then able to use this castle as a home base sort of thing. Pretty sure Matt Colville has a whole book about that. And then the ruin chanter either sticks around, becoming the castle's supernatural ward, or maybe even transcends and evolves into a new type of Fey spirit that fulfills the same role, but becomes even more powerful. In fact, I really like the idea that the more a ruin is preserved or restored, the more powerful the spirits associated with that place might become. It's an idea that's very in line with some of the lore in Theros, actually. So if you're running a Therosi campaign, just make one of these guys a type of eidolon or something. I'm not gonna go off on that tangent. I could talk about Theros literally all day. But that increasing power and all that stuff brings me to my final point, which is that just because ruin chanters aren't inherently evil doesn't mean there aren't evil ruin chanters who exist in the world. An evil ruin chanter who wants to orchestrate the downfall of a civilization, thus transforming the whole country into ruins, could be a compelling villain. They of course want more power, and the way they get that power is by expanding their domain, so they do their utmost to bring about that end. Though as a Fey creature, it's unlikely they're going to be laying siege and knocking down walls. I imagine their approach would be much more tricky, like playing the geopolitics game to incite warfare between two rival kingdoms and happily setting themselves up to rule over the ashes at the end of it all. But whatever you choose to do with this monster, as always, my 5th edition conversion can be found in the Google document linked down below in the description. Down there you'll find the stats for both the Ruin Chanter and the Ruin Elemental, along with all their lore and everything else you'll need to run this creature at the game table. And if you're one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon, you can find my Dungeon Dad high-res 5e PDF version of these two monsters, which contains all the same information, it's just laid out in a bit of a more fanciful way, includes the new artwork drawn this week by Tam, who knocked it out of the park, and it helps me keep doing what I'm doing here. Sincerely, thank you guys so much for all the support over on Patreon, which reminds me, it's time for Patron of the Week. This week's randomly selected patron is Scario. Thank you so much for the scary amount of support you throw my way each week, my friend. It means the most. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster you would like to see show up on a future episode of Monster of the Week, let me know in the description. You can't leave notes in the description. Let me know in the comments down below, or over on the Dungeon Dad Discord and the Monster Suggestions channel. It will be added to the master list of potential monsters, and who knows, you might just see it show up on a future episode of Monster of the Week. Did I say that already? In any case, thank you guys so much for watching. We've got a very special episode coming next week. We're going to be doing another, well, I'm not going to get into it here because there's literally a preview at the end of the video that's going to show you what's coming next week. So check that out, I guess. Or just wait till next week. Either way, it's going to be on the channel and it will be fun. That's all for now. I'll see you then.
What might seem like a silver dragon at first glance is actually something much more dangerous. The most villainous of the fairest dragons takes flight, and its sight is set on the most valuable treasure the world has to offer. Next episode, Chromium Dragons. Tune in next time for lots more fan service.